I'm an alcoholic.
And more male teachers. So the teaching profession is becoming steadily more female over time.
Yeah.
Now 24% of K-12 teachers are women. It was 33% in the hang on, did I say women or men?
You said women.
Right, so it's the wrong way around. 24% of K-12 teachers are men. It was 33% and it's dropping.
Interesting. I mean, that's true.
1
for
in
me.
10 elementary school teachers now are male.
Yeah.
Almost no early year. I mean, there are so few men in early education. It's astonishing. It's about 3%.
It's almost creepy. There's a social stigma around it, I feel.
Well, yeah, one of my kids works. One of my middle son works in early years education,
Right.
so he's experiencing this all the time. And of course, if you have such a small number of people doing anything, then it makes them seem weird.
Yeah.
And it was the same with women engineers not that long ago. Like, women engineers? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
So if you go against gender identity too strongly, then you're obviously going to get that effect. It's so crazy to me that as a share of the professions, there are twice as many women flying U.S. military planes as there are men teaching kindergarten.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
About 7% now of U.S. military pilots are women, about 13% of navigators. But that's twice as many. Why are women flying fighter jets, or why are men not teaching kindergarten?
Like, why that disparity seems interesting. Like, why
Well,
is there such a push?
We've worked really hard to open up military positions to women.
Right.
And so the US Air Force is redesigning all the cockpits of the planes
Oh, really?
to facilitate, because they have these height requirements. And so, of course, that excludes shorter men as well, but it disproportionately excludes women, right? If you have a minimum height to be able to sit in the cockpit
Right.
and shoot down.
The average height of women is X.
Yeah, then obviously you're excluding a much higher proportion of them.
Interesting.
So we've done that. But also just culturally, there's been a real push, I think, to say we do need more women in combat roles. I think if you go back 3 generals ago, the general in charge of North American Homeland Defense was a woman. And no one blinked. No one cared.
Right.
Right?
Well,
But
they probably shouldn't care.
no,
You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
What a sign of success it is.
Right.
When you don't care. But there have been almost no similar efforts to get men into teaching or
Interesting.
caring roles, etc.
Yeah.
There are no campaigns, there's no money, there's no even a sense that it's a problem that there are fewer and fewer men in our classrooms.
Do you think there's a financial incentive there where, like, I think men maybe disproportionately are trying to find jobs that are,
Better
high
paid.
paying
Yeah.
to make them more attractive to women, to be breadwinners in their family, etc. And if a kindergarten teacher isn't paying 6 figures, I think most men will be like, why would I pursue that?
Yeah, I think that is true. And it's worth saying that K-12 teachers haven't seen a pay rise for 20 years.
Exactly. That seems like
so,
part of the issue. If you want more men in there.
Yeah, and of course that in and of itself can create a little bit of a pushback, because it's like, oh, so what you're saying is that for teachers to get paid more, there has to be men doing it.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. Well, you can say that. But it's also true. It's true that men are a little bit more motivated by salary than women on average, and that one of the reasons people opt into those professions is because it's easier to combine it with family. Right. It comes back to these gender roles. But let's be realistic about this. Like, a lot of the jobs that men used to be able to do and earn decent money, they're not there anymore. And so if they're holding out for a manufacturing job that's going to pay as well as a K-12 teacher, well, you might be waiting quite a long time, or a coal miner, or whatever the equivalent is. And so there's a bit of a lack of the reality check here is, look, guys, actually teachers maybe don't earn as much as other people, but they earn pretty well, and it's very secure. There's lots of benefits. There are lots of good things about those professions that shouldn't put men off. And by the way, we used to have a lot more men doing them than we do now.
Right.
So why the trend away? Partly
is that partially the gender roles thing? Like, if women are just working at a lower rate in general in the labor force, like, of course men are going to be occupying every occupation at a higher percentage.
Correct. So just as more women have gone into the labor market, you've seen a big shift, for sure. But it doesn't. There's nothing that should necessarily suggest that teaching. By the way, I mean, psychology is even more true, which is crazy. Maybe we can talk about that. Why teaching should become a female profession. There's nothing written in stone about that. It didn't used to be like that. And you take professions like social work, used to be quite close to gender parity, massively falling away now. Psychology is the one that really interested me, and I've learned a bit more even since I wrote the book. In the last 10 years alone, the percentage of psychologists who are male has dropped from 39% to 29%.
Really?
Among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. And when I first wrote about this, I was thinking the reason that matters is because there are jobs there. These are growing professions. And so if men want jobs, maybe they want to go where the jobs are, right? And rather than sort of hoping that the coal mine's going to reopen, you should get a job as a teacher or a psychologist or something. But
that's a tough ask, though, right? Like,
it is tough because it goes against the identity. But the tougher the ask, the harder we should be working.
I guess.
Precisely because it's hard is why we should be doing it.
I'm growing up in like a bad neighborhood somewhere in the U.S. Like my parents aren't around. I don't have any economic mobility. And it feels like you're asking me to be like, hey, don't be an Uber driver. Go be a psychologist. And I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that? I should just go get a PhD. Like it feels harder to me if I'm in that situation to just I don't know if you remember the rhetoric around like people like telling truckers to learn how to code. Do you remember this?
I do remember.
Like truckers were like, hey, our jobs are getting phased out due to automation. People were like, learn to code, grow up.
Yes.
And it's like, it feels like an oversimplification and kind of like an antagonistic barb to put at people that are kind of struggling in the States, frankly.
Yeah, I think I agree that you have to get the tone of this really right. And the truckers coding thing is a great example of how even for good intentions, people can just like say really stupid stuff that just misses where people are coming from and where they want to go. And also, of course, we have no idea necessarily how many coders we're going to need, especially now that the AI has learned to code.
Exactly.
Right? So
AI is going to destroy.
You've got GPT-3. Well, surely we're not the only ones worrying about this, right? It's like my son said to me, God, GPT-3 is writing code now. I said, wait, the computers are writing computer code?
Yeah.
It's like no one's watched any sci-fi. Like what's wrong with these people?
Yeah, it's terrifying.
But code, like, we're not going to need as many coders as perhaps everybody thought.
Right.
But there are jobs like, meanwhile, we have massive shortages of teachers, nurses, social care workers for kind of nursing homes and stuff. So those are real jobs. And if they're defined in the right way, I do not see why they should be so unappealing to men. They didn't used to be unappealing to men. And so if we let them become too gender skewed, right? If they become seen as quotes female professions, then it is hard to get the guy who's in that neighborhood to think he'll laugh at you if you say to him, have you thought about being a nurse?
Yeah, which
he'll
I
laugh
think
at you.
it probably is in that place now socially. Like for me personally, I view nursing as a female profession.
Yeah.
I view being a K through 6th grade teacher as a female profession.
Right. And you're right. Statistically, of course, you're right.
And through my own personal experience, like going to, granted I was homeschooled till like 4th grade. So definitely female.
Yeah. Well, all my kids' elementary school teachers were female.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but then, okay, so we then have to decide, does that matter? Because if it doesn't matter, okay, fine. Let's just let the trend continue, and and eventually we'll just have an all-female teaching profession.
Right.
And every boy in the classroom is only going to see female teachers. But what happens then, I think, is the whole idea of education and of educational success and of loving learning for its own sake and so on starts to be seen as a feminine attribute. Because if the boys see, the girls are already doing much better than them in class. If all the teachers are then female, and most of the people at colleges are now 60% female on college campuses.
Yeah, that was true for me also.
Right. And so there's a danger you hit a tipping point where actually just persuading a boy that education is for him, that it's a quotes masculine thing, is going to be a problem. So then you hit a tipping point from which it's very hard to come back. And so as I see the proportion of teachers heading towards 80% being female, I worry what that means for the message we're sending to boys about education, educational success, and risking anecdote rather than data. I know that in my secondary school, the fact that I had a male English teacher is one of the reasons I'm sitting here, because it taught me to love writing and poetry and ideas and so on.
That's why you talk like that with the accent.
Yeah,
It's from him. He's a British guy.
I did
You grew
go
up
to
in
school.
Baltimore.
I did grow up in the UK. That's
Oh, that
right.
also helps.
He was British. But I do remember having quite a big... Now, maybe it would have been the same if he'd been a woman, but I honestly feel like for me, it helped
Right.
that it was a man teaching me poetry.
I think that's true. I mean, the professors and teachers that I keep in touch with were typically men.
Yeah.
Just because there was much more like interconnectivity, and I loved my my woman teachers and
Yeah, I had great female teachers too. But that's actually this great phrase from the women's movement, which is you have to see it to be it.
Yeah, I think representation is important across the board, both racially, within gender, class, everything.
So all I'm doing is I'm applying that insight that you have to see it to be it to areas where currently men and boys men are hugely underrepresented.
Interesting.
So you've just mentioned you see these things as female, right? When was the last time you heard someone say female lawyer or female doctor? I'm going to suggest a while, because
it's been a while.
It's 50-50.
And if I did hear it, I'd be like, ooh, that sounds
exactly
sexist.
But male nurse,
Yeah.
Male kindergarten teacher.
Man bun. That's what I wear. People always call that male. I'm like, hey,
That's
it's just a
incredibly
bun.
it's just
It's
a
just
bun.
a bun. Let me have my
just
bun.
exactly. It's so stereotypical. I feel your pain.
No, you don't. That's interesting. Now, I'm curious, like, this might be a little bit out of your study of expertise, but do we need gender parity in every occupation? I mean, it's a broad question,
No.
but
No.
and so it's important in some things, especially, nurturing like academic careers, but
Here's what I think. So 2 things. One is I don't think we will get exact gender parity in every occupation.
right.
And we should be okay with that to the extent that we're sure it's the result of genuine choices and genuine preferences and not artificial barriers. So for example, I think the fact that we're now at 50-50 representation in law and medicine is great, because I don't think there's any particular reason why men or women should be less or more likely to want to be a lawyer or a doctor. But deep sea fishermen, still predominantly male.
Right.
And I don't think that's going to get to 50-50.
Right.
And I think that is not because there are millions of women desperate to become deep sea fishermen who are being blocked by sexism from doing it.
Right.
It is to some extent the result of differences in preferences. Maybe firefighter would be another example. Now, what you want to do is make sure there's enough representation and that the barriers are not, that you can do it should you choose to.
Right.
Because there's always going to be some people that want to do it. And that's a difficult balance, of course. Like, what's the number? But I tend to think of, if I look at any profession and see that there's only, say, 5% of women or men in it, I'm immediately thinking, there's something going on there. There's probably something going on there. When you get to 30%, you might start to think, okay, it's not necessarily going to keep going to 50.
I see.
Right? And the danger is that conservatives will sometimes say, well, of course we don't have women politicians or women engineers. Their brains don't work like that. I'm stereotyping conservatives horribly here, but let's for fun, let's do it, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. We can stereotype here. It's fine.
Okay, right. Their brains are different.
Yeah.
Right? And you're like, okay, even to the extent that there are genuine differences between male and female psychology, the distributions overlap so much that couldn't possibly explain why only 5% of engineers are women.
Yeah,
it might explain why only 30% of engineers are women.
That's about the cutoff for you for most occupations.
Roughly. And actually, there is a very good study I have in the book. It's quite far in the book, so you may not have gotten to it.
Haven't got there.
In fact, this chapter, I think it's chapter 13, so you definitely didn't read this bit. But there's a lovely study by Rong Su and James Arounds where they look at what would occupations look like if men and women were choosing them based on their real preferences. Now, they have these personality profiles, so they've used those to say, here's what we think the world would look like under real choice. And they get to numbers like about 30% of engineers would be women,
Okay.
that number I just gave you, and about 30% of nurses would be men. Not 50%,
Right.
because there are still some differences on average, but a heck of a lot more than 5%. Or 15% is currently the number of women engineers, and 10, 11%, 12% is the number of nurses that are men. So I love that paper because I thought that's exactly the kind of analysis you want, which is to say, what would it look like under conditions of real equality? And it wouldn't necessarily be 50-50. It doesn't have to be 50-50 to prove equality, but it's sure as hell not 5, except for maybe some very rare examples. Maybe fighter pilots.
Right.
Maybe there's always going to be a gender disparity in fighter pilots or firefighters or something, because there just are differences between men and women in their interests and preferences.
And also, I think
That's
consumer preferences too. So my wife is a midwife, so she delivers babies.
Yeah.
And many women that are giving birth, especially if they're doing it in their home or in a birth center, typically, a lot of them would like a female midwife.
Yes.
They feel like it's a much more intimate experience.
Yeah, that's
and so
reasonable. That's a great example of an area where you probably wouldn't want gender parity.
Right.
Actually.
Yeah. But I guess the opportunity to be in the marketplace should be open to both men and women.
That's right. Midwife's a really good example. I love the fact, by the way, you had to explain to me what a midwife did.
Look, you're writing books all the time, okay?
I've had 3 kids.
You haven't had any kids, right? Your wife had kids.
Okay, fair. But I was present at the birth of all 3, and I could tell you stories about that, but that's probably for another show.
Fair.
That's a really great example, actually, of a place where you would want the option to select into someone of the same sex. And so, am I okay with a world where there aren't very many male midwives? Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
But are there equivalents the other way around? Well, it's hard to think of any off the bat, but I think one of the reasons I care so much about things like counseling and psychology and maybe special needs teachers, right? Most kids referred to special needs are boys, but most teachers are women. Most special needs teachers are women. And so you might want to say, actually, I'd quite like it if there were a lot more male special needs teachers. Maybe not all male, but given that most of their clients are male, like midwives, by definition, their clients are female. Or maybe there could be some other areas too, mentoring programs, etc., where you'd actually be very comfortable with a very strong male skew.
Right. Interesting.